Welcome, sleepy traveler, to a story that has lived in the margins of history for nearly 500 years. A whispered name you've perhaps heard in passing, but whose truth has been largely forgotten. You've found Catherine, your quiet corner for the most intimate and shadowed tales of the Tudor world. Tonight, we step deep into the darkness that surrounded one of England's most scandalous families, to find the hidden life of a woman born under a cloud of sin, born in shadow, born to walk forever between worlds. Her name was Catherine Carey. To the surface of the Tudor court, she was simply the daughter of Mary Boleyn and a courtier named William Carey. But beneath that official story lived another truth, one that whispered through the chambers of power for her entire life, one that she may have known but could never speak, one that shaped every breath she took in the shadow of the throne. You see, Catherine Carey's mother, Mary Boleyn, had been the mistress of King Henry VIII, and some historians, many historians, in fact believe that Catherine herself was the king's illegitimate daughter, never acknowledged, never recognized, but always near the center of power, watching, witnessing, existing in that painful place where you are close enough to greatness to feel its warmth, yet forever separated from its light. This is a woman who would become chief lady of the bedchamber to Queen Elizabeth I, serving in the most intimate and powerful role a woman could hold at court. If the whispers are true, she served her own half-sister without that truth ever being spoken aloud. She would mother 16 children. She would survive the dangerous reigns of 5 different monarchs. She would live a life so deeply connected to the most famous and powerful figures of her age, and yet remain almost unknown to us today. Tonight, we will tell her story from beginning to end, a complete journey through the life of a woman born in sin, raised in shadows, beloved by a queen, and remembered by almost no one. This is the whispered story of Catherine Carey, told gently and slowly, perfect for the descent into sleep and dreams. Before we begin our tale, I'd love your help growing our little shadow community here at Catherine. A simple like makes an enormous difference. It helps other lovers of forgotten history and whispered stories discover us. And please, drop a comment telling me if you could ask Catherine Carey one question about her life at court, or about her possible connection to Henry VIII, or about her bond with Elizabeth, what would you most want to know? I read every single comment, and your thoughts genuinely brighten my days and help me know what stories matter most to you. Subscribing means you'll never miss another shadow story, and it would mean the world to me. The people forgotten by history deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible. Now, let's settle in. Let's dim the lights and step into the candlelit world of the Tudors, where Catherine Carey awaited her fate. Let's begin. In the year of our Lord 1520, in the early months of winter, when the cold settled into the bones of England and fires burned day and night, in the chambers of those who could afford to light them, a wedding took place that would set the course for a life lived always in hidden places. The bride was Mary Boleyn. The groom was William Carey, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber to King Henry VIII, a man of decent birth but no great fortune, no great title, no great power. By all measures, it was a respectable match. By all measures, Mary had done well for herself, but those in the knowing circles of the court understood something more. They understood that Mary Boleyn had caught the eye of the king himself. They understood that this marriage, so conveniently arranged at just the right moment, was a way of covering something that could not be allowed to remain uncovered. This was the beginning of Catherine Carey's story. This was the shadow that would follow her for the rest of her life. Let's step back further, and let's understand the world into which Catherine Carey would be born. To do that, we must understand her mother. Mary Boleyn was born sometime near the turn of the 16th century. Exactly when, no one knows. History is so often unclear about the births of women, unless those women became queens. Their births are recorded in dusty ledgers in Latin, if they are recorded at all. But we know that Mary was probably the eldest of the surviving Boleyn children. We know that she was raised in a world of power and influence that was always just within reach, but never quite secure. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was climbing the ladder of Henry VIII's court, seeking titles and lands and the favour of the king. Her mother came from good stock, and Mary herself, from her earliest years, was trained to be useful to her family. The Boleyns were ambitious people. They were not yet the most powerful family in England, but they could see the path that led there. And Mary, beautiful and charming by all accounts, was to be one of the tools of that ambition. She was groomed for greatness. She was trained in the arts of conversation and music and dancing. She was taught to be alluring. She was taught to understand the ways of power. The girl was sent to France, that place of culture and sophistication that all ambitious families wanted their daughters to know. There, in the courts of French kings, Mary learned languages and arts and courtly ways. There, in the sophisticated salons of Paris and at the royal court of King Francis, Mary learned how to captivate men. There, if the whispers are to be believed, she caught the eye of King Francis of France himself, that he became her lover. Whether true or not, what mattered was that she returned to England with a reputation that was both intoxicating and dangerous. By the time Mary came back to her homeland, she was in her 20s. She was known for her beauty, not the conventional, pale, blonde beauty that was most admired in the English court, but something more exotic, more worldly, more intriguing. She was known for her skills and sophistication. She was known for being wise in the ways of love and pleasure, and she was known for being available, let us say, to the advances of powerful men. King Henry VIII noticed her. This is certain. We know it because the king himself said so. The King of England, in the early 1500s, was still a young man himself, powerful, athletic, convinced of his own right to do as he wished. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for many years, and his eye had begun to wander. When it fell upon Mary Boleyn, it stayed there for some considerable time. The affair between Henry and Mary lasted for an unknown period. Historians argue about how long. Some say months, some say years. What we know is that it was known. The court whispered about it. People saw the king with Mary. People understood what was happening, and people saw the rewards that came to Mary's family: grants of land, positions of influence, marks of favor that could only come from a man who held power. Years later, when he was being accused of improper behavior with Anne Boleyn, Mary's sister Henry responded by saying that he had bedded Mary, yes, but never her mother. He had bedded the sister, but not the mother. The king himself was acknowledging the affair, using it as a defense against other accusations. This is how we know, with certainty, that it happened. The affair between Mary and the king could not have lasted forever. Rumors of the king's attention were dangerous things. They could elevate a family or destroy it, and so the decision was made. Mary must be married off, quickly, to a man of good birth, a man of discretion, a man who would claim her as his wife, who would give any children she might bear a legitimate name, a legitimate place in the world. And that man was William Carey. William Carey was approximately 6 years older than Mary Boleyn. He came from Wiltshire, from a place called Chilton Foliot, a family that had land and connections, but not overwhelming power. He was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, which meant he was close to the king in intimate ways, close enough to serve him in his private chambers, close enough to be trusted with secret things. He was a man of fashion and style. He was a man who had done well for himself at court through intelligence and charm and political astuteness. And he must have known what he was doing when he married Mary Boleyn. He must have understood, on some level, that the woman he was taking as his wife had very recently been the object of the king's intense affection, that the child she might bear could be William's legitimate heir or could be the king's bastard, that his entire fortune, his entire future, depended on maintaining the fiction that whatever happened now, whatever was born into this marriage, was born as his legitimate heir and should be treated as such. Yet William Carey married her anyway, whether out of love, or out of ambition, or out of a complex mixture of both, we cannot know. But he married Mary Boleyn, and he committed himself to the fiction that would sustain her through all the years to come. They were married on the 4th of February in the year 1520. By all accounts, it was a good match. Mary seems to have cared for William. The king continued to favour him, continued to grant him lands, continued to employ him, continued to allow him close access. The Boleyns rose higher in the world. Thomas Boleyn, Mary's father, began to hold more important positions. The family's wealth increased. The family's power grew. And then, sometime in the early months of 1524, historians debate whether it was January or February or March. Catherine Carey was born. History does not record exactly where this birth took place. It could have been at Chilton Foliet in Wiltshire, the ancestral home of the Carey family, in a house of stone and wood where many generations of Careys had been born. It could have been at Hever Castle, the Boleyn family estate, a castle surrounded by a moat in the county of Kent, where the Boleyn women often retired to give birth, surrounded by their female relatives, away from the eyes of the court. It could have been at some other place entirely, lost to history now. We will never know. History, as it so often does, is silent on the details of women's lives, especially when those details matter most. But somewhere, in a chamber lit by candles that burned with a smoky flame, with the sounds of servants moving outside the door and midwives attending to the labour, with the smell of herbs burning in the braziers to purify the air and ward off spirits, Mary Boleyn gave birth to a daughter. The child was healthy. The child was female. The child was vigorous and strong. Within days, she was christened Catherine, which was a name full of significance in the Tudor world. Catherine of Aragon was Queen of England at that very moment, the woman that Henry had married when he was young and hopeful. Perhaps this naming was meant as some sort of tribute, some sort of gesture toward legitimacy, or perhaps the name was simply chosen because it was a name that belonged to queens and great women. We cannot know the minds of those who named her, and from the moment Catherine Carey drew her first breath, she was born into shadow. Was she the daughter of William Carey? Legally, yes. Without any question whatsoever, she was his legitimate daughter. He claimed her. He raised her. He loved her, by all accounts that survive. The documents of the Tudor court record her as his child. There is no official question about it. But was she the biological daughter of the king himself? We cannot know with certainty. History has not given us the kind of evidence that would allow us to know for absolute sure. But we know the timing was right. We know that Mary had been with Henry VIII in the months before Catherine was conceived. We know that the years of Catherine's birth were the same years that Mary was still receiving marks of the king's favour lands, money, positions of honour. We know that Henry VIII never denied the possibility, and he denied so many other things, so very many accusations and charges. Most importantly, we know that Catherine herself seems to have believed it. In the years to come, in the letters and documents that survive, in the accounts of those who knew her and wrote about her, there are hints, there are whispers. There is a woman who understands that she is connected to the king, connected to power, connected to greatness, in a way that no one can ever speak aloud. She carries this knowledge with her. It shapes her. It defines her. For now, though, Catherine was simply an infant, born into the early years of the 1600s. She would have been nursed either by her mother or by a wet nurse. as was common among families of good birth who had the means to employ such help. She would have been cared for by servants who attended to her every need. She would have been dressed in fine clothes, appropriate to her station. She would have been given every advantage that a gentleman's daughter of good birth could expect. But even in infancy, she was a child of secrets. Even in the cradle, she was marked by the shadow of that sin, the sin of her mother's affair with the king, the sin that had to be hidden beneath the respectable cover of marriage to William Carey. She was born into shadow. She was born beneath a cloud. She was born to live, for the rest of her life, in that painful in-between space where you know something that you cannot speak, where you carry a secret that could destroy you if it was ever revealed. The child grew. She was intelligent. She was capable. She was educated in the way that the Boleyn family educated their daughters, which is to say, better than most girls of her time. The Boleyn family believed in educating their daughters, which was unusual, almost revolutionary, in their time. Unlike many girls of her age and station, Catherine would learn to read and write not just in English but in other languages. She would learn French, because that was the language of diplomacy and of courts. She would learn some Latin, because that was the language of learning and of the church. She would learn the skills of a lady of the court, how to walk, how to speak, how to present herself, how to navigate the unwritten rules that govern the behavior of women in the dangerous world of royal politics. Her father, William Carey, was devoted to his family. He loved his daughter. He made sure she was cared for with as much care as if she had been his legitimate daughter, which, of course, in the eyes of the law and the world, she was. He made sure she had the best education that could be provided. He made sure she was given every opportunity. The early years of Catherine's life were, in many ways, blessed. She had a father who loved her. She had a mother who cared for her. She had the advantages that came from belonging to a family that was rising in power, that was moving ever higher in the favor of the king. But in those early years, too, change was coming. Change that would tear the world apart. Change that would transform everything. The year was 1526, or perhaps 1527. The exact chronology of King Henry VIII's obsession with a new lady of the court is debated by historians and scholars, but what matters is that from this moment on, everything changed, everything transformed, everything that had seemed stable and secure became uncertain. The king had fallen absolutely, completely, utterly in love with a new lady of the court. Her name was Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was younger than Mary. She was probably in her early 20s when she came to the attention of the king, when she caught his eye in that way that would change the course of English history. She was not the beauty that Mary was. We have no portraits of Anne from her own lifetime, and the descriptions that survive are contradictory. Some people said she was beautiful. Others said she was plain. Some said she had a sharp face, an aquiline nose, dark eyes that sparkled with wit. What everyone agreed on was that she was fascinating. She was fascinating because she had something that Mary did not have. She was fascinating because she had wit. She had intelligence. She had an ability to captivate a man's mind, not just his body. She had an understanding of politics and power that was unusual in a woman. She had ambition. She had dreams. She also, crucially, had ambition that went beyond what Mary had wanted. Where Mary had been content, or at least had seemed to be content to be the king's mistress, and then to move on, to accept a good marriage and a pension and a life of comfort and respectability, Anne wanted something more. Anne wanted to be queen. Anne wanted to wear the crown. Anne wanted to be the wife of the king, not his mistress, not his illegitimate lover, but his true queen. This created a new dynamic. The king was still married to Catherine of Aragon, the wife who had given him no male heir, the wife who was getting older and past the age of bearing children. If Henry wanted a new marriage, He would have to find a way to end his old one. And Anne would lead him to believe that this was possible, that the Pope could be persuaded, that the marriage to Catherine could be annulled, that the way would open up for Henry to marry her instead. The courtship between Henry and Anne lasted for years. It was tumultuous. It was public in a way that the affair with Mary had never been. It was dangerous. It was, in many ways, the catalyst that would destroy the world that Catherine Carey had been born into. During these years, the Boleyn family rose higher than they had ever risen before. Thomas Boleyn, Mary and Anne's father, was elevated in rank. He was made Earl of Ormond. He was made Earl of Wiltshire. He was given lands and estates and positions of power. Their uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, became more and more powerful. The Boleyns were at the center of everything, at the center of the king's attention, at the center of power, at the center of the great religious changes that were sweeping through England and changing everything about the world. But there was also danger. There was the constant, gnawing fear that a word out of place, a gesture misunderstood, could bring it all crashing down. There was the knowledge that favor was temporary, that the king's attention could shift at any moment, that what seemed secure one day could be utterly destroyed the next. And for Mary Boleyn, there was something else. Her sister was becoming something that she could never become. Mary had been the king's mistress, yes, this was true, and the king had even acknowledged it when it suited him. But that was all she had been. She had been cast aside, not brutally, but set aside nonetheless, given a pension of £100 a year, given a husband of good birth, given the appearance of respectability, but removed from the intimacy of the king's attention. She was a woman with a past. She was a woman who had served her purpose. But Anne was different. Anne was becoming something entirely new. Mary's daughter, Catherine, was growing up in the shadow of her aunt's rise. Catherine was growing up watching her aunt, this beautiful, fascinating woman with her dark eyes and her sharp wit and her ambition, steal the king's affection from her mother. Catherine was growing up understanding, on some level that a child could understand, that her aunt was going to be queen, that her aunt was going to wear the crown that Catherine of Aragon wore, that everything was changing. We don't know much about Catherine's childhood years. We don't know exactly how she spent her days. We don't know what she thought about or felt about or dreamed about. We know that she was being educated. We know that she was a member of a family of rising importance. We know that she was bright and intelligent and capable of understanding the complex political world around her, perhaps too capable of understanding it. We know she was present when her aunt became queen. In the year 1533, on the 25th of January, King Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn. The marriage was secret at first. Anne was already visibly pregnant with the king's child, and there was urgency to formalize the relationship before the child was born, before the scandal became too obvious, before the whispers became too loud. But within days, within hours really, the whole world knew. The king had divorced Catherine of Aragon, or rather, he had declared that marriage null and void, which was his way of divorcing her without actually saying the word divorce, and he had married Anne Boleyn instead. The Boleyn family had reached the heights of power. Anne was queen. Thomas Boleyn was honoured. Their uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was more powerful than ever. They had done it. They had risen to the top. And Catherine Carey, now perhaps 10 years old, perhaps 11, was witness to all of this. She was present in the royal household. She knew this woman who was now queen. Perhaps she held her hand during the coronation ceremony. Perhaps she was part of the small circle of people who loved and cared for Anne, who attended her, who helped her prepare for the day that would define her as queen. 6 months after Anne became queen, Anne gave birth to a daughter. The labour was difficult. Everyone had expected a son. The king had wanted a son, needed a son to secure the dynasty. needed a male heir to show that his marriage to Anne had been right and necessary and divinely ordained. But what Anne gave him was a daughter, a beautiful, healthy, intelligent daughter, a daughter who would, one day, become one of the greatest queens England ever knew. The child was named Elizabeth. Catherine Carey was the cousin, or possibly, if the whispers were true, the sister of this child. She was present in the royal household when Elizabeth was born. She knew this child. Perhaps she held her. Perhaps she was part of the small circle of people who loved and cared for the infant princess from the very beginning. But the relationship between Anne and Mary was complicated. It was complicated by passion and betrayal and the memory of things that could not be forgiven. Anne had not forgiven her sister for having been with the king before her. The rivalry between them was intense, almost violent in its intensity. There were stories, some true, some probably exaggerated by those who loved to spread court gossip of Anne's cruelty to her sister. There were accounts of Anne's sharp words and sharp looks. There were stories of Anne pushing Mary away, of Anne wanting to erase the memory of Mary from the court entirely. Anne had arranged a pension for Mary, yes, as we mentioned, but she had done this not out of kindness, but out of a desire to be rid of her sister entirely. She had pushed her out of the court. She had tried to remove her from the king's vicinity. She had wanted Mary gone. And yet, the sisters were still sisters. Family bonds in the Tudor world were complex. They were bonds of power and ambition, bonds that could be used and manipulated and weaponized. But they were also, sometimes, bonds of genuine affection. They were bonds that could not be entirely severed, even when everything else fell away. What we know is that during the years when Anne was queen, Catherine Carey was in the household. She was being educated. She was learning the ways of the court. She was learning how to navigate the unwritten rules that governed behavior, how to watch carefully and speak carefully and present herself in just the right way. She was becoming the kind of young woman who could survive in that treacherous world. She was also learning what it meant to be close to power and to be forever outside it at the same time. Because Catherine was not a princess. She was not a queen. She was not even the daughter of a queen. She was the daughter of a gentleman of the privy chamber and a lady of the court. She was a cousin of the queen by marriage, but she was not a child of the king, at least, not officially, not in any way that could be acknowledged. Or was she? Some historians now believe that Catherine was in the Tower of London when her aunt, Anne Boleyn, was executed. Some believe that she was there to comfort her aunt, to distract her, to give her some small solace in those final hours before the sword fell. They believe that Catherine, perhaps 13 years old, was present when her aunt faced the executioner. We cannot know if this is true, but if it was true, then Catherine Carey was present at one of the most devastating moments in her family's history. She was present when her aunt, the woman who had risen so high, who had been so powerful, who had been Queen of England, was brought to the scaffold and executed for crimes that were almost certainly fabricated. She was there when the woman who had been the most powerful woman in England was killed. She was there when everything changed. Historians debate this fiercely. Some say Catherine was in the Tower. Some say she was not. The records are unclear. The chronicles of the time don't mention her specifically. But if Catherine was there, she would have been 14 or perhaps 15 years old. Old enough to understand what was happening. Old enough to understand that the women of this world were always vulnerable, always one step away from catastrophe, always at the mercy of the men who held the power. Old enough to understand that being queen was not protection. Old enough to understand that nothing was safe. What we do know is that after Anne Boleyn's execution, Catherine's brother Henry was taken from his mother and placed in the household of Henry VIII himself. The king arranged it. The king himself took a hand in raising Mary's son. The king himself made sure that Henry Carey was educated, was cared for, was brought into the royal household. Some people wondered why. Some people whispered that perhaps it was because the boy was the king's own son. Some people whispered other things entirely. What we know is that Catherine remained in her mother's care, but her status had changed. She was no longer the cousin of the queen. She was the daughter of a disgraced woman. She was the niece of a woman who had been executed for treason. She was the niece of a family that had fallen from the heights of power into shame and disgrace. But the Boleyns were survivors. They were resilient. They had the ability to fall and then to rise again. And though they had fallen from the very top of power, they did not fall all the way to the bottom. They still had lands. They still had connections. They still had the memory of having been powerful. Catherine's mother, Mary, had married again after the king tired of her. She married a man named William Stafford, a soldier of reasonable birth, but without great fortune or great family name. He was a man who had served in the wars. He was a man who had survived. We are told that Mary married him for love, which was unusual in her time, and tells us something about her character. She was willing to give up everything her family's favor, her position at court, her security, her pension, even for the possibility of a quieter life with a man she cared for. But her ambitious family never forgave her for this. Her ambitious family saw it as a betrayal of all that they had worked for. Anne was furious with her sister for this marriage. Thomas Boleyn cut off her financial support. Mary was cast out, no longer a part of the great game of courtly politics. She was a woman who had been at the center, and now she was relegated to the edges. And Catherine, growing into womanhood, had to watch her mother's fall. She had to watch her mother be cast aside by her own family. She had to understand that loyalty, that love, that bonds of blood, none of it was enough to protect you. That if you did something that displeased the powerful people around you, you could be cast out. You could be abandoned. You could be left to make your own way in the world. But Catherine herself was not abandoned. The Boleyn family protected their own, even when they were disappointed in them. Catherine was educated. Catherine was trained. Catherine was prepared to make a good marriage and to use that marriage to secure her position. Catherine was groomed to survive. And then, at last, the day came when Catherine Carey would step into the light, or at least into the partial light of the Tudor court. The day was coming when she would meet the man she would marry, the man who would stand beside her for the rest of her life, the man who would love her and help her navigate the dangerous years ahead. The year was 1539. King Henry VIII had been married 4 times and divorced or widowed 4 times. The court was in constant flux, like the sea responding to the pull of the moon. People rose and fell according to the whims of the king and the shifting religious and political tides of the nation. It was a dangerous place. It was a place where a word out of place could ruin you. Catherine Carey, now perhaps 15 years old, perhaps 16 historians debate her exact age, was brought into the household as a maid of honor to Anne of Cleves, the king's new wife. Anne of Cleves was a German princess, brought to England from the continent in hopes of making a politically useful marriage. She was brought to England to secure an alliance with the Protestants of Germany, to make a statement about the religious direction of the kingdom. The marriage would not last long. The king famously found her unattractive, found her disappointing, found her not what he had been promised, and he would soon divorce her. But while it lasted, the young women of the court who served her were necessary. Catherine was chosen. We don't know exactly why. Was it because she was intelligent and capable? Was it because of her family connections, even though those connections had fallen from their great heights? Was it because of her education and her ability to move gracefully through the court? Was it because someone in the king's circle had recognized something about her, some quality, some potential, some worth? Or was it simply because the king, who had been so close to her mother all those years ago, wanted to see her, wanted to observe her, wanted to have this possible child of his own nearby, where he could watch her, where he could see what she was becoming? We cannot know. But Catherine Carey entered the king's household, and she entered it in a role that would keep her close to the center of power for the rest of her life. It was in this year, 1539, that Catherine first met Francis Knollys. Francis was a young man of about her own age, perhaps a year or two older, perhaps younger, we cannot say precisely. He was a gentleman of the court, the kind of young man who was rising in favor, who had good connections, who was clearly on his way to something important. He was intelligent, he was capable. He was a man who knew how to navigate the complex political waters of the Tudor court. He came from a family that had benefited from the religious changes sweeping England. They were staunch Protestants, in an age when being Protestant was becoming more and more important. The family was climbing in power and influence. Francis himself was rising. He was moving in the direction of greater things. According to the records of the court, both Catherine and Francis appeared at the same time and place when Anne of Cleves was welcomed to England. Both of them are mentioned in the official records of the time as being present at the same ceremonies, the same events. Perhaps they met then, when they were both there to welcome this foreign princess. Perhaps it was an accident of circumstance. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps, as some suggest, the meeting was arranged by others who thought it would be a good match. What we know is that by April of 1540, Catherine and Francis had married. The marriage took place on the 26th of April in the year 1540. It was, like most marriages of the time, likely arranged. That is, the two families came to an agreement that the marriage would be beneficial to both sides. The negotiations probably took weeks or months. The details were probably hashed out carefully. That didn't mean that Catherine and Francis didn't care for each other. In fact, all evidence suggests that they did, that they had genuine affection for each other. But they didn't marry for the kind of romantic love that we imagine today. They married because their families arranged it, and because it made sense politically and socially. And yet, something beautiful happened. Francis and Catherine seem to have genuinely loved each other. The evidence for this is in the records of their life together. Francis was a successful man. He rose in favor at court. He was knighted. He was given lands and honors. He was made a Knight of the Garter. He was made treasurer of the royal household. Catherine, as his wife, shared in these successes. But what's striking is how devoted he seems to have been to her. There are hints in the records, glimpses of genuine affection, and how devoted she seems to have been to him. For nearly 30 years, they were together. They were separated, sometimes by necessity. Francis had to serve the king, had to be at court, had to travel, had to serve as a soldier in the wars. Catherine had to manage their estates, had to raise their children, had to hold the family together during the times when Francis was away. But they came back to each other again and again. They built something together, and they had children. Many, many children. According to the records, particularly the Latin dictionary that Francis kept, where he recorded the birth of each of his children, they had 16 children together. 16. In an age before reliable contraception, before understanding of family planning, before any technology or methods to prevent pregnancy, Catherine spent much of her marriage either pregnant or nursing or recovering from childbirth. Year after year, the pregnancies continued. This is the hidden cost of marriage in the Tudor age. This is what a woman's life actually consisted of. Not the romance, not the jewels, not the prestige of being married to a rising courtier, but the endless, exhausting cycle of pregnancy and birth and nursing and the death of so many children before they reached adulthood. The physical toll of repeated pregnancies, one after another, year after year. We know the names of the children who survived to adulthood. Mary, who would marry. Henry, who would become a member of Parliament. Lettice, who would become famous in her own right, who would marry Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and become one of the most influential women at Elizabeth's court. William, who would become an earl himself. Edward, Richard, Robert, Thomas, Francis, Anne, Elizabeth, Catherine, and more. So many more. But we also know that some of the children died. Some died very young. Some died in infancy. Some were stillborn. This was the truth of the Tudor age for every child who survived to adulthood and went on to have a life of their own, to marry and have children and make their own way in the world. There might be another child who died, might be siblings who were lost to fever or accident, or the mysterious illnesses that could strike down a child in the night. Catherine had to survive all of this. She had to survive the physical toll of repeated childbirth. The pain, the danger for childbirth in the 16th century was a dangerous thing, and every pregnancy carried with it the possibility that the mother would not survive. She had to survive the emotional toll of losing children, of burying babies, of standing by graves. She had to survive the constant pressure of being at court, of having to present herself in the right way, of having to navigate the treacherous politics of a royal household, while also being a mother to a growing family. She had to survive, in other words, something that would break many women. But Catherine was strong. She was intelligent. She was capable. She was resilient. During these years, Catherine also began to develop a deep connection to the young Princess Elizabeth. This is perhaps the most important relationship of Catherine's life, more important even than her marriage, though her marriage supported and sustained her through it all. This is the relationship that defined her. This is the relationship that gave her life meaning. Elizabeth, as we mentioned, was born in 1533 to Anne Boleyn. She was Catherine's cousin, technically, but there was something more between them than simple cousinship. When Elizabeth was born, Anne Boleyn was Queen of England, and Elizabeth was a princess of the realm. She was the daughter of the Queen. The whole court knew her. The whole kingdom celebrated her birth. But then Anne was executed, and Elizabeth's status changed dramatically. Suddenly, Elizabeth was no longer a princess. She was the bastard daughter of an executed traitor. She was a girl whose mother had been taken to the scaffold, whose mother had been charged with the most heinous crimes. For a time, there was a serious question about whether she would even be allowed to live, whether the king would order her execution as he had ordered her mother's. But Henry VIII, in one of his mercurial moods, in one of his moments of perhaps half-remembered affection, or perhaps just political calculation, decided to spare the child. Elizabeth was allowed to live. She was allowed to remain in England, but she was sent away from court. She was brought up in relative obscurity, in the households of various nobles, away from the center of power. For the next several years of her childhood, Elizabeth was often ignored, sometimes in danger, always uncertain of her position. And Catherine Carey was there. Catherine, who was the daughter of a woman who had also been cast out, who had also lost favor, who had also had to survive in the shadows of the court, was there for Elizabeth. Catherine understood what it meant to be on the edges. Catherine understood what it meant to be vulnerable. We don't have detailed records of how close they were during these early years. There are gaps in the historical record. There are silences where we wish we had words. But we have hints. We have the sense that Catherine understood Elizabeth in a way that perhaps no one else did. Catherine knew what it meant to be born in the shadow of scandal. Catherine knew what it meant to be connected to the king, but never acknowledged. Catherine knew how to survive in that grey place, that in-between world. And as Elizabeth grew up, as she became smarter and more capable and more aware of her own danger, as she learned the lessons that the court taught so harshly, Catherine was still there. Catherine was her anchor. Catherine was the one person she could trust. By 1553, when Mary I became queen, and the religious landscape of England shifted dramatically, when Protestant became a dangerous thing to be, Catherine was one of the most important people in Elizabeth's life. Catherine was the woman she could depend on. Catherine was the woman who loved her. Catherine was the woman who would never betray her, who would always stand by her, who would risk everything for her. The year was 1553. King Henry VIII had been dead for 5 years. He had died in his bed at Whitehall Palace, having grown fat and old and bitter. His son, Edward VI, had ruled for most of the years following Henry's death. Edward was bookish, intelligent, sickly. He was also, in many ways, a prisoner of the men who served as his regents and advisors. They governed the kingdom in his name while he was still young. They pulled him in different directions according to their own ambitions. During Edward's reign, the kingdom had shifted increasingly toward Protestantism. The religious changes that Henry had begun the break with Rome, the establishment of the Church of England, had accelerated under the rule of Edward's regents. The Mass was performed in English instead of Latin. The monasteries had already been dissolved, and their lands distributed to nobles and courtiers. The old ways were being erased. The future was Protestant. Then, in 1553, when Edward was only 15 years old, he died. The young king who had represented the Protestant future of England was gone, and Mary Tudor, the older sister of Elizabeth, became queen. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She had been passed over for the throne when her father married Anne Boleyn. She had been treated badly. She had been forced to watch as her father married again and again, as he rejected the woman who had been her mother, as he moved further and further away from the Catholic faith that meant everything to her, that had defined her life. She had been declared illegitimate. She had been at risk of execution. She had survived by keeping quiet, by being invisible, by following the rules even when she disagreed with them violently. But now, finally, she was queen, and Mary was determined to undo everything that had been done during the reign of her Protestant brother. She was determined to bring England back to Catholicism. She was determined to restore the old ways, the old faith, the old order. She was determined to find and punish those who had helped create the world of Protestantism that she hated. For people like Catherine and Lettice Knollys, who were staunch Protestants, this was a moment of terrible danger. This was the crucial moment. This was the moment that would define not just Catherine's life, but her entire identity. This was the moment when she would have to choose. Lettice Knollys was not content to simply hide his beliefs and keep silent. He was not content to live quietly and hope that the religious persecutions would pass him by. He was not content to attend Catholic Mass and pretend that he believed things he did not believe. Instead, he made a decision that would have been utterly shocking to many men of his time. He decided to flee England, and Catherine, his wife, decided to go with him. Imagine the weight of this decision. Catherine had everything. She had a position at court. She had lands in Berkshire and in Oxfordshire. She had property. She had the security that came from being the wife of a successful man, the wife of someone who had the favor of the king. She had children living, breathing, beloved children who needed her, who depended on her, who were her responsibility. She was no longer young. She was in her late 20s, approaching 30, approaching the years when a woman's life became more settled, more secure. This was not the time in a woman's life to start over. This was not the time to abandon everything and flee into exile with uncertain prospects, with no guarantee that she and her family would be safe. And yet, she chose to flee. She chose to abandon everything. She chose to follow her husband into exile, into uncertainty, into danger. She chose to take her children with her. Why would she do this? The answer is that she was a woman of genuine principle. She believed in the Protestant faith, not just believed in it intellectually, but believed in it in her heart, believed in it enough to make enormous sacrifices. She believed in it enough to give up the security of her life in England. She believed in it enough to take her children and go into exile, where there was no guarantee of safety or comfort or security. This tells us something crucial about Catherine Carey. She was not just a woman trying to survive. She was not just a woman trying to maintain her position and her comfort. She was a woman of faith, a woman of conviction, a woman willing to sacrifice everything for what she believed in. She and Francis fled to Germany. They made their way to cities like Frankfurt and Basel, places where English Protestants were gathering to escape the persecutions in their homeland. They lived there with their children in exile. They lived in a foreign land, speaking a foreign language, far from everything they knew. And during this time, something remarkable happened. Elizabeth, the young princess, who was also in danger because she too was Protestant, and because she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and because her sister Mary suspected her of harboring ambitions to the throne, harboring hopes of overthrowing her, reached out to Catherine. We have the record of this reach out in the form of a letter that Elizabeth wrote to Catherine. In this letter, written in 1553, Elizabeth calls Catherine her cousin. Elizabeth expresses her love. Elizabeth expresses her desire to see her cousin, her grief at being separated from her. And Elizabeth signs the letter with a phrase in Latin, cor rotto, broken heart. The letter reads, "Relieve your sorrow for your far journey with joy of your short return, and think this pilgrimage rather a proof of your friends than a leaving of your country. The length of time and distance of place separates not the love of friends, nor deprives not the show of goodwill. An old saying, when bail is lowest, boot is nearest. When your need shall be most, you shall find my friendship greatest." In these words, we hear the voice of a young woman. Elizabeth was perhaps 20 years old when she wrote this, expressing her deepest feelings to the woman who had been a mother to her in so many ways. We hear the voice of a girl who was frightened, who was uncertain, who was in danger, who needed to know that someone loved her, that someone would stand by her. Relieve your sorrow for your far journey with joy of your short return. Come back. I need you to come back. Come back to me. When bail is lowest, boot is nearest. When things are worst, help is nearest. When your need shall be most, you shall find my friendship greatest. When you are in the darkest moment, when you most need someone, I will be there for you. I will not abandon you. These are not the words of a mere cousin greeting a relative who has left the country. These are words of profound love, of desperate longing, of a promise to never forget, of a connection that transcends the ordinary bonds of family. And the signature, cor rotto, broken heart in Italian and Latin. Elizabeth's heart was broken, broken at the thought of being separated from Catherine, broken at the uncertainty of whether she would ever see her again. This letter tells us everything we need to know about the relationship between Elizabeth and Catherine. It tells us that they loved each other. It tells us that the bond between them was real. It tells us that Catherine was the most important woman in Elizabeth's life. In exile, Catherine had the time and space to think about her life. She was away from the constant demands of the court. She was away from the pressure of having to present herself in just the right way, of having to navigate the complicated politics of the royal household. She was with her husband, whom she loved. She was raising her children, but she was also far from England, far from the position she had built, far from everything that had defined her for so long. What we don't have are many records of what Catherine actually did or thought or felt during these years in exile. We know that she lived in Basel and Frankfurt. We know that she had more children. The steady stream of pregnancies continued even in exile. We know that her husband was building a life there, connecting with other English Protestant refugees, becoming part of a community of exiles who were all waiting for something to change. But the inner Catherine, the thoughts and feelings of a woman living in exile, cut off from her homeland, separated from the queen she loved, uncertain whether she would ever see her again, remains largely hidden from us. We cannot know what she thought as she lay awake at night in a foreign land. We cannot know what she dreamed. We cannot know whether she regretted her decision to flee, or whether she was content in her faith and her convictions. What we do know is that during this exile, Catherine was carrying with her the connection to Elizabeth, the connection that had been formed through all those years at court, through all those moments of being together, through all those unspoken understandings between two women who both knew what it meant to survive in the shadows. That connection was real. That connection was powerful. And Catherine was nurturing it from afar. And she was waiting. She was waiting for the day when Mary would die, when Elizabeth would either become queen or die herself, or something else would happen to change the course of their lives. The exile lasted for 5 years. 5 long years of living in a foreign land. 5 years of being cut off from the life she had known. 5 years of watching her homeland from a distance as it descended into religious persecution. 5 years of hearing about the burning of the Marian martyrs, men and women, who were brought to the stake and burned because they refused to give up their Protestant beliefs. 5 years of knowing that the life she had known had been transformed. 5 years of knowing that she might never go home again. 5 years of waiting. The year was 1558. Mary I, the Queen of England, was dying. She had reigned for 5 years. In that time, she had done enormous damage to the soul of the nation. She had tried to force England back into Catholicism. She had married King Philip II of Spain in an attempt to secure her dynasty and secure the Catholic faith in England. The marriage was a disaster. Philip came to England, said Mass, and left again, leaving Mary with no children and a broken heart and a nation that resented the Spanish king. She had made enemies. She had made mistakes. She had also ordered the execution of hundreds of Protestants. They called it the burning of the Marian martyrs. Good men and women, people of conviction, people of faith, were brought to the stake and burned because they refused to give up their Protestant beliefs. Bishops, ministers, ordinary people, they were burned. They were martyred. Lettice Knollys and Catherine Carey could have been among them if they had remained in England. They had saved their lives by fleeing. They had saved their faith by going into exile. But on November 17, 1558, Mary died. And on the same day, the very same day, Elizabeth was proclaimed Queen of England. The Protestant princess had become the Protestant queen. The woman who had been in danger, who had been vulnerable, who had written that heartbreaking letter to Catherine in exile, she was now the most powerful person in England. Catherine and Francis rushed home. They left their exile and returned to England. And they returned to a world that had been transformed. Elizabeth was queen, the sister who had been in danger, who had been vulnerable, who had written that heartbreaking letter to Catherine. She was now in a position to reshape the nation, to bring Protestantism back, to undo all of the damage that had been done during Mary's reign. She was in a position to do great things. And one of the first people Elizabeth moved into her household was Catherine Carey. Catherine was appointed Chief Lady of the Bedchamber. This was the highest position that a woman could hold in the royal household. The Chief Lady of the Bedchamber was the most senior among all of the ladies in waiting. She had access to the Queen that no one else had. She was present at the Queen's most intimate moments, helping her dress in the morning, helping her undress at night, being present when the Queen was ill or weary or frightened. She had influence. She had power. She had responsibility. For the first 10 years of Elizabeth's reign, Catherine combined this most senior position with motherhood to more than a dozen children. This was an almost impossible task. She had children who were at different stages of life. She had children who needed her guidance and her presence and her love. And she had a queen who needed her, who depended on her, who expected her to be there at court. How did she do it? We don't know. We don't have the details of how she balanced these impossible demands. We don't know what she sacrificed to make it work. We don't know how often she was torn between duty to her children and duty to her queen. Why did Elizabeth choose Catherine? The official answer is that Elizabeth had few female relatives who she felt close to, and Catherine was one of them. Elizabeth's mother was long dead. Her sister Mary was dead. She had cousins, but they were distant. Elizabeth had few women in her life who she could truly trust, who she could truly depend on. But the reality was deeper than that. Elizabeth trusted Catherine. Elizabeth loved Catherine. Catherine was the only connection that Elizabeth had to her mother, Anne Boleyn. Catherine had known Anne. Catherine had been in her household. Catherine, perhaps, had even been present when Anne died. Catherine was also the repository of secrets. Catherine knew things about Elizabeth's birth, about the scandal that surrounded her mother, about the dangers that Elizabeth had faced as a young woman. Catherine understood Elizabeth in a way that no one else did. Catherine was someone who had lived through the same dangers, the same shadows, the same uncertainties. And Catherine was Protestant. Catherine had proven her faith by going into exile. Catherine had been willing to sacrifice everything for her beliefs. Elizabeth could trust her absolutely. Living at court as chief lady of the bedchamber, Catherine was now in the center of power in a way she had never been before. She was not the queen, she could never be the queen, but she was the closest person to the queen. She was the one who heard Elizabeth's fears and concerns and desires. She was the one who helped the queen navigate the treacherous world of court politics. She was the one person who could be completely honest with the queen, who could tell her truths that no one else dared to speak. But there were consequences to this position, and these consequences were borne by Catherine's children. The court was jealous. The court was competitive. The court was full of people who wanted Catherine's position, who wanted Elizabeth's favor, who resented the closeness between the queen and this older woman. They whispered about it. They watched for signs of weakness. They waited for Catherine to make a mistake. Catherine's children were sometimes not allowed to come to her at court. There are hints in the records that Francis Knollys, Catherine's husband, was sent away on assignments that kept him separated from his family, kept him away from Catherine when she was ill or needed him. Elizabeth, in her need to keep Catherine close, sometimes demanded that Catherine stay at court, away from her family. This is the hidden price of power. This is the cost of being close to a queen. You gain influence and security, but you lose the ordinary pleasures of family life. You lose the ability to be there for your children. You lose the quiet moments at home. You lose the ordinary human connections that make life worth living. Catherine's daughter, Lettice, became one of Elizabeth's maids of honor, following in her mother's footsteps. Lettice would go on to become a famous woman in her own right, marrying the Earl of Leicester, becoming one of Elizabeth's closest companions. But not all of Catherine's children found their way so smoothly through the world. We know that Catherine experienced great personal loss during these years. We know that some of her children died. We know that she had to watch her children grow up, often without her daily presence in their lives. We know that she had to balance her duty to the Queen with her duty as a mother, and that this balance was often impossible. And we know that this burden, this constant, impossible burden of being chief lady of the bedchamber while being a mother to a large family took its toll on her. And yet, she remained. She remained at court. She remained in Elizabeth's service. She remained devoted to the woman she may have loved as a sister. even if that sisterhood could never be acknowledged, because the rumors had never gone away. The whispers about whether Catherine was the daughter of Henry VIII had never stopped. Historians debate this question. Some believe that Catherine was the king's daughter, some believe that she was not. But the question itself, the very fact that it could be asked, meant that both Catherine and Elizabeth carried this knowledge with them. And if Catherine was the daughter of Henry VIII, and if Elizabeth was also the daughter of Henry VIII, then Catherine and Elizabeth were half-sisters. But this could never be spoken aloud. This truth had to be buried. Elizabeth needed to be free from these shadows, to rule as a queen in her own right, not as the daughter of a disgraced king, and Catherine had to be content with her position, powerful in its own way, but limited, close to the queen, but always secondary. This was the consequence of her birth in shadow. This was the consequence of being born under the cloud of that sin. Catherine survived it. She endured it. She built a life within these constraints, but it could not have been easy. The burden of knowing a secret that you can never speak, of carrying a truth that could destroy everything, of being close to power, but forever outside it. This was the reality of Catherine's life. The years passed. Elizabeth reigned. Catherine served. The world changed around them in ways both great and small. The 1560s, the 1570s, the years when England became more and more secure in its Protestantism, the years when Mary, Queen of Scots, became a prisoner in English hands, and Lettice Knollys was assigned to guard her. The years when the tension between England and Catholic Spain grew greater and greater. The years when Elizabeth navigated the dangerous waters of international politics, balancing between marriage proposals from foreign princes and the demands of her own subjects who wanted her to marry and produce an heir. Catherine was aging. She was no longer the young woman who had fled into exile. She was no longer the woman who had borne children every year with the reliability of the seasons. She was past the age of bearing children. She had raised her children. She had seen them grow. She had seen them marry. She had seen them take their places in the world. Francis, her husband, was also aging, but he was rising higher in the government. He was made a privy councillor. He was made treasurer of the royal household. He was knighted by the Queen, and then he was made a Knight of the Garter, one of the highest honours in the land. By the 1560s, Francis was one of the most important men in the kingdom, and Catherine was one of the most important women. But in the last years of Catherine's life, there came a separation. Francis was sent north to guard Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, the Catholic Queen of Scotland, had fled to England and put herself under Elizabeth's protection. But Elizabeth could not trust her. Mary represented a threat. Mary represented everything that the Catholic powers of Europe wanted a Catholic queen on the throne of England. Mary was dangerous. Francis was put in charge of guarding her. It was an important assignment. It was a position of trust. But it meant that he had to be away from his home, away from his family, away from his wife. And when Catherine fell ill, Francis was not allowed to leave his post to be with her. This is one of the most poignant details in Catherine's story. The man she had loved for nearly 30 years, the man she had gone into exile with, the man who had given her 16 children and shared her life in all its complexity, he was not allowed to leave his post to be with his dying wife. Such was the cost of being close to a queen. On the 15th of January in the year 1569, Catherine Carey, Lady Knollys, died at Hampton Court Palace. She was approximately 45 years old. She had lived her entire life at the centre of English power. She had survived the reigns of 4 different monarchs: Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. She had borne 16 children. She had gone into exile for her faith. She had served as chief lady of the bedchamber to one of England's greatest queens. She had been a mother and a wife, and a woman of principle. And now she was gone. Elizabeth herself was devastated. When the Queen learned of Catherine's death, she was overcome with grief. She wept. She raged. Here was a woman who had been everything to her, a mother, a confidant, a link to her own mother, Anne Boleyn. Here was the one person who had loved her consistently, who had stood by her always, who had never failed her. The grief was profound. The loss was real. Elizabeth did something extraordinary. She paid for Catherine's funeral out of her own household expenses, and she paid far more than she usually paid for funerals, even for women of high rank. The exact amount was £640 to 11d, a vast sum for the time. Catherine was buried in Westminster Abbey, in St. Edmund's Chapel. A stone monument was placed there with an inscription. The inscription reads, "The Right Honourable Lady Catherine Knollys, Chief Lady of the Queen's Majesty's Bedchamber and wife to Sir Francis Knollys, Knight, Treasurer of Her Highness's household, departed this life the 15th of January, 1568, at Hampton Court, and was honourably buried in the floor of this chapel, at Rotherfield Grays in Oxfordshire, where Catherine and Francis had lived when they were away from court, where Catherine had managed estates and raised children and built a home. A more elaborate monument was raised. There is a tomb with effigies of both Catherine and Francis, showing them lying side by side, carved in stone. There are pillars and decorative elements, and there are inscriptions in Latin. One of them reads, O Francis, she who was thy wife, behold, Catherine Knoll lies dead under the chilly marble. I know well that she will never depart from thy soul, though dead. Whilst alive she was always loved by thee. Living, she bore thee. Her husband, 16 children, equally female and male, that is, both gentle and valiant. Would that she had lived many years with thee, and thy wife was now an old lady. But God desired it not, but he willed that thou, O Catherine, should await thy husband in heaven. These words speak to the depth of feeling that Francis had for his wife. Catherine had been a good woman. Catherine had been a good wife. Catherine had borne him many children. Catherine had stood beside him through all the dangers and changes of their age, and he had loved her. After Catherine's death, Francis lived for many more years. He continued in his role in the government. He continued to serve Elizabeth. He lived to be approximately 70 years old, dying in 1596, more than 20 years after Catherine had gone. But he had lost his wife. He had lost the woman who had stood beside him through all of the changes and challenges of their age. He had lost the person who knew him best. And now, nearly 500 years after her death, Catherine Carey remains largely unknown. If you ask people about the Tudors, they will mention Henry VIII. Everyone knows Henry VIII. They will mention Anne Boleyn, the tragic queen, the queen who was executed. Everyone knows her name. They will mention Elizabeth I, the great queen, the queen who ruled for 45 years and made England a major power. Everyone knows her. They may mention Mary, Queen of Scots. They will mention the great men Thomas Cromwell, William Cecil, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, but they will not mention Catherine Carey. They will not know her name. If you ask 100 people about Tudor history, perhaps 1 or 2 might have heard the name Catherine Carey, and even then, they would know almost nothing about her. Catherine has faded from history. The woman who was chief lady of the bedchamber to one of England's greatest queens has become almost invisible. The woman who loved Elizabeth I, who may have been her half-sister, who was the most important woman in the Queen's life, has been forgotten. And yet, she matters. She matters because she represents all of the women who were powerful without being famous. All of the women who wielded influence from the shadows. All of the women who were close to power but never held it officially. all of the women who shaped history without being remembered for it. She matters because she was a woman of principle. She was willing to abandon everything she had, her position at court, her security, her home, her status for the sake of her faith. She was willing to go into exile and live in uncertainty. She was willing to risk everything for what she believed in. She matters because she loved. She loved her husband, and he loved her. They built a life together that lasted nearly 30 years. She loved her children, even when duty kept her away from them. She bore 16 children and raised them in a world that was constantly changing, constantly dangerous. And she loved the Queen, the woman who may have been her half-sister, and she gave that love faithfully and completely until her death. She matters because she understood what it meant to be born in shadow. Catherine came into the world as the daughter of a woman who had been the king's mistress, as the possible illegitimate daughter of the king himself. She lived her entire life under the suspicion that she was not who she appeared to be. This mark followed her always. This secret haunted her, and yet she made something of her life. She didn't let the shame destroy her. She didn't let the uncertainty paralyze her. She used the gifts she had been given: intelligence, beauty, resilience, the ability to survive in dangerous places, the ability to love completely, to build a life of meaning and influence. In many ways, Catherine's story is the story of every woman who has ever had to navigate a world that is not built for them. Every woman who has ever had to be careful about what she says and does and thinks. Every woman who has ever had to find power in places where official power was denied to her. Every woman who has ever had to survive in the shadows. Catherine did not have a vote. She did not hold a title as a woman holding office. She did not have the rights that women have today. She was legally the property of her husband, bound by laws that made her nothing in her own right. She could not own property in her own name. She could not make contracts. She could not appear in court. Legally and officially, she did not exist as a separate person from her husband. And yet, she was powerful. She was influential. She mattered. What we can take from Catherine's life is this: that influence comes in many forms. That power is not always the obvious kind. That the women who are most important in history are sometimes the ones who are most invisible. That the women who change the course of events are sometimes the ones whose names are forgotten. Catherine Carey lived in the shadow of the great events of her time. But from that shadow, she helped shape the world. She helped shape Elizabeth's reign. She helped the Queen navigate the treacherous waters of international politics. She helped Elizabeth survive. She helped Elizabeth become the great queen that she became. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy she left us, not the memory of her name, because that has been lost, but the understanding that it is possible to matter even when you are not remembered, that it is possible to have influence even when history forgets you, that it is possible to live a life of meaning and depth and love even in the shadows. So we remember Catherine Carey now. We remember the young girl born under the cloud of scandal, born to a woman who had been the king's mistress, rumored to be the illegitimate daughter of the king himself. We remember the woman who had to navigate the treacherous waters of 5 different reigns. We remember the exile and the return, the love and the loss, the power and the exile, the darkness and the light. We remember Catherine Carey, and in remembering her, we honor all of the women like her, the women whose names have been lost to history, the women who stood in the shadows and held the world together, the women who loved without being celebrated for it, the women who gave their lives to others, the women who made a difference in quiet ways. Her story does not end in triumph. It does not end with Catherine being celebrated and honored by her nation. It does not end with statues erected in her honor, or books written about her, or plays performed about her life. It ends in the quiet moment of her death at Hampton Court Palace, far from her husband, but perhaps in the arms of the Queen she served. but it was a life nonetheless. It was a full life, a complicated life, a life lived with intelligence and grace and courage, a life worth knowing about, a life worth thinking about, a life worth remembering. And now, nearly 500 years after her death, Catherine Carey remains largely unknown. If you ask people about the Tudors, they will mention Henry VIII. Everyone knows Henry VIII. His name echoes through history with the weight of 6 marriages and the fall of monasteries. They will mention Anne Boleyn, the tragic queen, the queen who was executed. Everyone knows her name. They will mention Elizabeth I, the great queen, the queen who ruled for 45 years and made England a major power in the eyes of Europe and the world. Everyone knows her. They may mention Mary, Queen of Scots. They will mention the great men Thomas Cromwell, William Cecil, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. These are the names that historians write about. These are the names that get chapters in books. These are the names that are taught in schools. But they will not mention Catherine Carey. They will not know her name. If you ask 100 people about Tudor history, perhaps 1 or 2 might have heard the name Catherine Carey. And even then, they would know almost nothing about her. They might not even know how to spell it. They might confuse her with someone else entirely. Catherine has faded from history. The woman who was chief lady of the bedchamber to one of England's greatest queens has become almost invisible. The woman who loved Elizabeth I, who may have been her half-sister, who was the most important woman in the Queen's life, has been forgotten. And yet, she matters. She matters because she represents all of the women who were powerful without being famous, all of the women who wielded influence from the shadows, all of the women who were close to power but never held it officially, all of the women who shaped history without being remembered for it. For every king and queen whose name we know, there are hundreds of people around them, advisors, lovers, children, servants, friends whose names we have forgotten. Catherine Carey is one of them. But Catherine was more than just a woman who happened to be near power. Catherine was a woman who actively shaped the world around her. Catherine was a woman whose influence radiated outward from the shadows into the light of history itself. Consider Elizabeth I, the great queen, the woman who ruled England for 45 years, the woman who defeated the Spanish Armada, the woman who brought her nation into a new age of security and prosperity, the woman who became, for many people, the symbol of female power and independence. We remember Elizabeth. We celebrate Elizabeth. We write books about Elizabeth. But what we often forget is this: Elizabeth would not have become Elizabeth without Catherine. Think about it. When Elizabeth was a child, when her world was falling apart, when her mother was executed and her status was uncertain and her very life was in danger, Catherine was there. Catherine held her. Catherine loved her. Catherine showed her that it was possible to survive in the shadows, to navigate dangerous waters, to keep moving forward even when everything seemed hopeless. When Elizabeth was a teenager, when she was living in obscurity, when she was ignored and sometimes mistreated, Catherine was there. Catherine was her anchor. Catherine was the person who made her feel loved, who made her feel safe, who made her feel like she mattered even when the world was telling her that she didn't. When Elizabeth became queen, when she suddenly had all this power and responsibility and danger swirling around her, Catherine was there. Catherine was the one person Elizabeth could trust absolutely. Catherine was the one person who loved her not for her power, but for herself. Catherine was the one person who would tell her the truth when everyone else was telling her lies. For 10 years, for the most critical first decade of Elizabeth's reign, Catherine was there beside her, in the bedchamber, in the private chambers, in the moments when the Queen was not performing the role of the great Elizabeth, but was instead just a woman, tired and worried and uncertain. How much of Elizabeth's success came from Catherine's counsel? How many decisions did Elizabeth make because Catherine advised her? How many crises did Catherine help her navigate? We will never know for certain. History did not record these moments. No one wrote down what Catherine whispered in Elizabeth's ear when they were alone together. But we can infer. We can look at Elizabeth's decisions and see her wisdom. We can look at her stability and see evidence of someone who knew how to survive, who knew how to navigate danger, who knew how to keep moving forward. And we can recognize Catherine's influence in all of it. Catherine taught Elizabeth how to be a woman in a world of men. Catherine taught her how to find power when power was not given to her. Catherine taught her how to love without being destroyed by love. Catherine taught her how to survive. Catherine's influence extended far beyond just Elizabeth. Though Elizabeth was the greatest of her influences, Catherine had 16 children. 16. And her children went on to have their own lives, their own families, their own influence on the world. Her daughter Lettice married Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Robert Dudley was one of the most powerful men in Elizabeth's reign. He was the Queen's favourite. Some people whispered that she loved him romantically. Whether that was true or not, what we know is that he was influential, and that Lettice, Catherine's daughter, became one of the most important women in Elizabeth's court. She was a confidant of the Queen. She was a woman of political importance. She shaped events. And Lettice's son, Catherine's grandson, was Thomas West, the 3rd Baron de la Warr. And when English colonists sailed to America, they named a place after him, Delaware. A state that exists today, centuries later, bears the name of Catherine Carey's grandson. How many people who have visited Delaware, who have lived in Delaware, who have driven through Delaware, know that the state is named after the grandson of a woman most people have never heard of? Her son Henry became a member of Parliament. Her son William became an earl. Her children married well. Her children had influence. Her children carried forward her bloodline and her legacy into the future. But the real legacy of Catherine Carey is more subtle than titles and names and positions. The real legacy is in the way she lived. The real legacy is in the way she loved. The real legacy is in the way she survived. Catherine was a woman who was born under a cloud. She may have been the illegitimate daughter of the king. She carried that uncertainty with her her entire life. She never knew for certain who her father was. She never knew for certain what that meant. She never knew if the secret would be revealed and destroy her. And yet, she did not let that destroy her. She did not let the shame paralyze her. She did not let the uncertainty make her bitter or angry or resentful. Instead, she used what she had been given. She used her intelligence. She used her beauty. She used her ability to survive in dangerous places. She used her capacity to love completely and faithfully. She used all of these gifts to build a life of meaning and purpose. She married a man who loved her. She bore children and raised them. She served a queen who loved her like a sister. She went into exile for her faith. She came back home. She lived a full life, a complicated life, a life lived in the shadows, but a life that mattered profoundly. And here is the thing about Catherine Carey that we should understand. She never complained. We have no record of her complaining about her position. We have no record of her feeling sorry for herself. We have no record of her regretting the choices she made. She accepted her life. She lived it fully. She made the best of what she had been given. This is a lesson for all of us who have ever felt like we were living in someone else's shadow. All of us who have ever felt like we were on the edges of things. All of us who have ever felt like we didn't matter as much as we wanted to matter. All of us who have ever felt like we were close to greatness, but never quite in the light. Catherine teaches us that you can matter, even if the world doesn't see you. Catherine teaches us that you can have influence, even if no one credits it to you. Catherine teaches us that you can live a meaningful life, even if history forgets your name. Catherine teaches us that the shadows are not a place of shame. The shadows are a place where you can see more clearly sometimes. The shadows are a place where you can move more freely sometimes. The shadows are a place where real relationships happen, real love happens, real influence happens, even if the world never knows about it. Think about the women in your own life, the women who have shaped you, the women who have loved you, the women who have supported you. How many of their names will be remembered? How many of their stories will be told? How many of them will be known to history? Probably not many. Probably most of them will be forgotten. Probably most of them will be known only to the people who loved them. Probably most of them will have no statues erected in their honor, no books written about them, no plays performed about their lives. And yet, they matter. Their influence shapes the world. Their love changes lives. Their wisdom echoes forward into generations they will never know. Catherine Carey is one of those women. She is one of the thousands of women whose names have been lost to history. She is one of the millions of people who have shaped the course of events without ever getting credit for it. She is one of the countless individuals who have lived meaningful lives and then been forgotten. But in remembering Catherine, we remember all of them. In telling her story, we tell the story of every woman who has ever had to navigate a world that is not built for them. In honoring Catherine, we honor all of the forgotten people of history. Catherine Carey lived in the shadow of the great events of her time, but from that shadow, she helped shape the world. She helped shape Elizabeth's reign. She helped the Queen navigate the treacherous waters of international politics. She helped Elizabeth survive the dangers that threatened her. She helped Elizabeth become the great queen that she became. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy she left us, not the memory of her name, because that has been lost, but the understanding that it is possible to matter even when you are not remembered, that it is possible to have influence even when history forgets you, that it is possible to live a life of meaning and depth and love, even in the shadows. So we remember Catherine Carey now. We remember the young girl born under the cloud of scandal, born to a woman who had been the king's mistress, rumored to be the illegitimate daughter of the king himself. We remember the woman who had to navigate the treacherous waters of 5 different reigns. We remember the exile and the return, the love and the loss, the power and the limitation, the darkness and the light. We remember Catherine Carey, and in remembering her, we honor all of the women like her, the women whose names have been lost to history, the women who stood in the shadows and held the world together, the women who loved without being celebrated for it, the women who gave their lives to others, the women who made a difference in quiet ways. Her story does not end in triumph. It does not end with Catherine being celebrated and honored by her nation. It does not end with statues erected in her honor, or books written about her or plays performed about her life. It ends in the quiet moment of her death at Hampton Court Palace, far from her husband, but perhaps in the arms of the Queen she served. But it was a life nonetheless. It was a full life, a complicated life, a life lived with intelligence and grace and courage, a life worth knowing about, a life worth thinking about, a life worth remembering. Outro. 700 words. And so we come to the end of Catherine Carey's whispered story, a life that began in shadow, lived always at the edge of power, and ended in a chamber at Hampton Court, where a queen wept for the loss of the woman she loved, like a sister, like a mother, like the only family she truly had. Catherine Carey was buried in Westminster Abbey, honored in death as she had been honored in life. And though her grave is marked, though her monument stands, though her words and her presence shaped the reign of one of England's greatest queens, she has been largely forgotten. The centuries have erased her. The centuries have made her invisible. Time has stolen her name from the memory of the world, but she should not be forgotten. Catherine Carey deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote in Elizabeth's story, not as a minor lady of the bedchamber, but as a woman in her own right, a woman of principle, a woman of strength, a woman of love, a woman who survived, a woman who endured, a woman who mattered. Thank you so much for walking through the shadows with me tonight here on Catherine. If this story touched you in any way, I'd be incredibly grateful for a like. It truly helps others discover these forgotten historical tales and whispered lives. And I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you could ask Catherine Carey one question about her life at court, or about her possible connection to Henry VIII, or about her bond with Elizabeth, what would you most want to know? Your engagement means everything to this channel and helps us grow. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider joining our community of shadow history lovers. We have so many more forgotten stories waiting to be told, more whispered lives, more hidden journeys through time, more women who stood in the shadows and shaped the world, more people who deserve to be remembered. There is something profound about remembering those who have been forgotten. There is something powerful about giving voice to the women whose names have been lost. In honoring Catherine Carey, we honor all of them. In telling her story, we acknowledge the countless people who have shaped history without ever receiving credit for it. In remembering her, we understand that influence comes in many forms, that power is not always the obvious kind, that the women who are most important in history are sometimes the ones who are most invisible. Sleep well, dear friend. Sleep well. And may Catherine Carey's whispered story stay with you in your dreams. May you remember that being in the shadows does not mean you do not matter. May you remember that love and loyalty are not always celebrated in the history books, but they matter. They matter profoundly. May you remember that even in the shadows, even in the silence, even in the forgetting we matter, we leave traces of ourselves in the world. We touch the lives of those around us. We shape the future, even if our names are lost. May Catherine Carey's love for Elizabeth inspire you. May her faith inspire you. May her courage in facing exile inspire you. May her loyalty to those she loved inspire you. May her acceptance of her position, her understanding that she could have influence even without being in the light, inspire you. And may you know that your own life, your own love, your own loyalty and courage, these things matter too. They matter even if the world doesn't see them. They matter even if history doesn't record them. They matter. Until next time, sweet dreams from Catherine. May the shadows hold you gently as you drift away into sleep. May Catherine's whispered story echo softly in your mind as you dream. May you wake tomorrow with the knowledge that the forgotten women of history are not truly forgotten. They live on in our memories, in our words, in the stories we tell. Sleep well, dear friend.